I'd like to tell them, but ask Miss Shaw to use her discretion. Janet Auchincloss didn't quite do that. She used her own discretion. Phoning the nurse, she began, "How are the children doing?" "They were fine," Miss Shaw replied. "A trifle confused, perhaps, but at their age they were resilient. They had been fed and were drowsy." "Mrs. Kennedy wants you to tell Caroline." Miss Shaw said in a low, desperate voice, "Please, no. Let this cup pass from me." "You must. There's no one else." "I don't have the heart. I can't destroy her little happy day." "I know, but you have to. Please, please, can't someone else do it?" "No, Mrs. Kennedy is too upset." Jacqueline's mother was determined to remove one last, perhaps crushing burden from her daughter's shoulders today. Hello, welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then I'm Jess Cannell, and it's nice to have you here. Welcome, and I hope to earn your subscription today. We are continuing our reading of William Manchester's serialized version of the death of a president. This was the only account that was granted authority and specifically requested by Jackie Kennedy. He took 40 volumes of notes with over 1,000 firsthand witnesses. So he did a bang-up job. These were published in early 1967. I have them in plastic so that they will be guarded and protected. We are going to finish up the account that was printed in this week, which was February 21st, 1967. And we will be going into part of the account that was recorded in March 7th's Look magazine from that year. So let's go ahead and get going. One of the things that we have all appreciated about this account is the thorough nature of the thing. He is giving us such a close look. We started this in November of 2024, and we're continuing it now in our spring break focus on John F. Kennedy and the assassination. One thing I want to note is that we have been through the pre-assassination hours in Fort Worth, the flight into Love Field, the actual motorcade, the moments after and surrounding the shooting, and then Jackie Kennedy and LBJ's experience at Parkland Hospital. We have also, in our last installment, gotten from Parkland Hospital back to Love Field, taken the oath of office, and now that's where we are. Someone ran off with the Bible, which was JFK's personal Bible. That's where the last account left us. Individual recollections of the flight were to vary sharply, but nearly everyone in the cabin felt the smoldering animosity. Mac Kilduff called it, quote, "the sickest plane I've ever been on." Clint Hill, who was Jackie Kennedy's personal Secret Service officer, you'll remember, he recalled, quote, "a great deal of tension between the Kennedy people and the Johnson people." Some made no attempt at camouflage. Ken O'Donnell was particularly vocal. Yeah, he would be. He was close to JFK and RFK. He was a Kennedy associate for sure. Twice, Johnson sent Bill Moyers back to ask O'Donnell and O'Brien to sit with him. They flatly refused. And Godfrey McHugh strode up to the press pool seats to make certain the reporters knew about it. "I want the record to show," he said, pounding the table between them to stress each syllable, "that Ken O'Donnell, Larry O'Brien, Dave Powers, and me spent this flight in the tail compartment with the president, President Kennedy." Ted Clifton entered that rear compartment on an errand for Johnson. Ken flashed, "Why don't you get back and serve your new boss?" Clifton asked McHugh, "What's eating him? I'm just doing my job." Only Moyers, the most generous of Johnson's advisors, refused to be aroused. Realizing how deeply Ken had been hurt, he declined the bait. As a native of Dallas, Johnson's secretary, Marie Famer, felt a special sense of torment, and she made a stab at pacification. She offered to order soup for the Kennedy secretaries. Lips tightened, heads were shaken. They didn't want soup, didn't really want an armistice. There was some talk of barring the press from Andrews. Johnson shook his head vigorously. It would, he said, look like we were panicking. At first, he contemplated a full-dress meeting of the White House staff upon arrival in Washington. Bundy advised against it, pointing out that the men there, too, were bereft. Moyers agreed, and Johnson reversed himself. Rufus Youngblood still felt that the Johnsons should spend that night at the White House, but Johnson said, "That would be presumptuous on my part. I won't do it." The agent argued that he had to think first of security. "I realize that," the president said, "but you can protect the elms, too, can't you?" Youngblood conceded that they could guard the Johnson home. Johnson beckoned to Moyers. He told him that he had no intention of entering the bedroom now. Perhaps the widow would like to use it to clean up. Moyers, the gentle Nexus, went back to tell Jacqueline Kennedy, but she declined Moyers' invitation because she had no need of the bedroom. Remembering the strangeness of the fresh clothes that had been laid out there, she reflected that during her 3 years in the White House she had learned much about Lyndon Johnson. Their rapport had been excellent, but a great deal depended on what the press was told when they landed. She sent for Kilduff and said, "You make sure, Mac. You go and tell them that I was not up front, but that I came back here and sat with Jack." Kilduff bowed his head and mumbled, "I will." The feeling that something must be done about Jacqueline's appearance had become universal. In the stateroom, the Johnsons and Ruth Youngblood were concerned about it, but so were the Sandees in the tail cabin. "Why not change?" McHugh asked her. She shook her head vigorously. Kilduff saw the rust-red blood caked under the bracelet on her left wrist and recoiled. Mary Gallagher, that's her dresser and kind of personal secretary. Mary Gallagher's first thought on arriving from the front of the plane was to fetch a warm washcloth and soap. Speaking in hushed tones, she consulted McHugh, Clifton, and Clint Hill about it until O'Donnell came over and said, "Don't do anything. Let her stay the way she is." Ken now grasped her purpose. Finally, she broke her silence and spelled it out to Dr. Berkeley. Kneeling, the physician indicated her ghastly skirt with a trembling hand. "Another dress," he suggested diffidently. "No," she whispered fiercely. "Let them see the horror." "You know what I'm going to have, Jackie?" Ken O'Donnell asked her suddenly. "I'm going to have a hell of a stiff drink. I think you should, too." She was dubious. She had promises to keep and miles to go, and a drink might trigger uncontrollable weeping. She asked, "What will I have?" "I'll make it for you. I'll make you a scotch." "I've never had scotch in my life." She hesitated, then nodded. Bracers were often prescribed for victims of shock. Ken brought her a tall, dark tumbler. It tasted like foul medicine, like creosote. Nevertheless, she drank it, and drank another. Indeed, after the funeral, when she had moved to Georgetown, scotch was the only whiskey she would take. She never learned to like it, but it would always remind her of that trip back from Dallas, of the hours she wouldn't permit herself to forget. The clutch of men standing around her emptied glass after glass. Kilduff later calculated that between Dallas and Washington, he consumed nearly 2/3 of a bottle of gin. Each of them was trying to survive the hideous ride, and if liquor would help, they wanted it. Liquor didn't help. It didn't do anything. Nothing testifies more persuasively to the passengers' trauma than their astonishing immunity to alcohol. Kilduff, having downed more than enough to anesthetize him, was still cold sober. And when Ben Bradley met Mrs. Kennedy and her escorts at Bethesda Naval Hospital, he was outraged. From their conduct, he assumed that no one had had sense enough to give them something to drink. Interesting. She did not appear drunk, apparently, to those around her. Goaded by a mighty tailwind, the presidential aircraft hurtled eastward at a velocity approaching the speed of sound. The plane was cleared to 29,000 feet. Colonel Swindoll was determined to go as high as he could, however, higher than anyone had ever taken President Kennedy, and he rose another 12,000 feet before leveling off. At this tremendous altitude, over 7 miles straight up, the sky overhead was naked and serene, and its tranquility deceptive. Andrews was relaying reports of tornadoes below, and behind him a cold front was moving in from Arizona. Already wild squalls were lashing the panhandle. At Love Field, the temperature was plunging, and the western sky was livid. Kennedy weather had left Dallas with him. In the southern sky, Swindoll saw a waif of a moon hanging ghost-like near the meridian. At first, he thought of the darkness as a blessing. Returning this way, it would be best to land in gloom. But as the light failed, the crescendo of the day hit him harder and harder. Swindoll had brought the president to Texas in exuberant spirits at the height of his remarkable powers, and now he was ferrying him back in a box. The passion of his own life had been spent. Behind him, as he thought of it then, were the president, the first lady, the vice president, and Mrs. Johnson. No aircraft commander had ever been charged with so grave a responsibility, yet he wondered whether he could make it to Andrews. He was near collapse. It became, in his words, a struggle to continue. His co-pilot was, if anything, in worse shape. Before the flight began, Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Hanson had been obsessed with the desire to leave Texas immediately. At any moment, he had expected the fuselage to be raked by machine gun fire, and twice during the wait for Sarah Hughes, he had started the engines on his own. The magenta twilight turned to olive gloaming and became dusk. The colonels looked out upon the overarching sky. Saturn dogged the moon. Jupiter lay over the Carolinas. The Big Dipper beyond Chicago. But the brightest light in the bruised blue canopy was Capella. Always a star of the first magnitude, it seemed dazzling tonight, and as the presidential plane rocketed toward West Virginia, it rose majestically 1,000 miles to the northeast, over Boston. Air Force One was 30 minutes away, maneuvering over the Shenandoah as Bob Kennedy looked out across the plain of oil-stained concrete. Andrews had never been an attractive base. Most of the field was now cloaked by night. But Kennedy glimpsed a group of television cameramen by the Matz Gate. He resolved to avoid them. Yet he was equally determined to be at Jackie's side the instant the plane stopped rolling. Casting about, he saw a deserted Air Force truck and vaulted over the tailgate. Sitting in almost total darkness among pieces of unfamiliar gear, he remembered the last time he had been here. It had been at noon on Saturday, October 20th, 1962. The missile crisis had just begun. U-2 reconnaissance had confirmed the presence of Russian sites in Cuba, and the president, alerted by phone, had flown in from Chicago on the pretext that he was suffering from a cold. The Attorney General had stood on this same barren stretch, waiting for his brother. Over Dulles International Airport, Swindoll knifed down through a thin overcast, and for the first time since leaving East Texas, saw land. Johnson was in the presidential bedroom, shaving, combing his hair, and changing his shirt again. Back in the tail compartment, Dave Powers told Roy, "Mrs. Kennedy wants you agents who were with the president to carry him off, and she wants Greer to drive." Knowing how the chauffeur was suffering, Kellerman was struck by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. Mrs. Kennedy herself was speaking to Evelyn Lincoln, Mary Gallagher, Muggsy O'Leary, and George Thomas, who had also been summoned. "I want you near the coffin," she said to each. And to Godfrey McHugh, she said, "I want his friends to carry him down." Ted Clifton came back to tell Ken O'Donnell, "The Army is prepared to take the coffin off." O'Donnell replied shortly, "We'll take it off." Ken passed the word in the staff area that Mrs. Kennedy wished to have those who had been closest to her husband accompany him upon debarkation. But there was a second president aboard, and it does seem clear that everyone had priority over the new chief executive, including stewards. 15 people were wedged into the tiny corridor. Kilduff saw that the president was left standing there in the stateroom. The acting press secretary was humiliated. Later in the evening, his embarrassment increased. At the executive office building, he discovered Johnson continued to be annoyed and that he held Kilduff responsible. The new president was still brooding over the incident the following afternoon. After presiding over the cabinet for the first time, he confided to one of its members that he had real problems with the family. According to this secretary's notes, set down later that same day, he said that when the plane came in, the family paid no attention to him whatsoever, that they took the body off the plane, put it in the car, took Mrs. Kennedy along and departed, and only then did he leave the plane without any attention directed or any courtesy toward him, then the President of the United States. But he said he just turned the other cheek. He said, "What can I do? I do not want to get into a fight with the family, and the aura of Kennedy is important to all of us." The eyes of the crowd were on the rear hatch, the president's. A ramp had been readied for the front entrance, and the Attorney General vaulted onto it unseen. He was pumping up the steps while it was still being rolled into place. Leaping in, he darted through the communications shack, the staff cabin, and the stateroom. Liz Carpenter, recognizing his gaunt features, reached out to pat his shoulder. He didn't notice her or the Johnsons. Next day, the president observed to one of his advisors that Kennedy hadn't spoken to him because he was intent on reaching one person. "I want to see Jackie," Liz heard him mumble. In the tail compartment, he slid behind and then beside Mrs. Kennedy. "Hi, Jackie," he said quietly, putting an arm around her. "I'm here." Those around them started. His voice was exactly like his brother's. Bob Kennedy slid open the plastic partition separating the rear of the ambulance from the front and asked, "Roy, did you hear they'd apprehended a fellow in Dallas?" Roy hadn't. For 2 hours, Lee Oswald had been news in the rest of the nation, but of 26,000 passengers, only those who had been watching the stateroom television set knew of it. "That's good," Kellerman said. "It was one man. At the hospital, I'll come up and talk to you." "You do that," said Bob, and closed the partition. Jacqueline Kennedy told him, "I don't want any undertakers. I want everything done by the Navy." He asked McHugh to see to that. Then a disjointed discussion ensued, touching upon the probable future of Kennedy aides, the delayed takeoff from Love Field, McHugh's role in that, and the explanation that the new president had offered at the time. "He said he had talked to you, Bobby," Jackie told her brother-in-law, "and that you had said he had to be sworn in right there in Dallas." The Attorney General was startled. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said. "He had made no such suggestion." This author, Manchester, notes, parenthetically, the author invited President Johnson to comment on this misapprehension. He replied that he had nothing to add to his statement to the Warren Commission. Leaning gently on the coffin, Mrs. Kennedy whispered, "Oh, Bobby, I just can't believe Jack has gone." Her luminous eyes fixed on a gray curtain over his shoulder. She described the motorcade, the murder in the sunlight, and the aftermath. For 20 minutes, he listened in silence. Afterward, he said, "It was so obvious that she wanted to tell me about it that whether or not I wanted to hear it wasn't a factor. I didn't think about whether I wanted to hear it or not. So she went through all of that." Without comment or expression, he heard the full horror of Dallas, heard the tale told in the husky, dulcet voice that came to him softly across the casket. And then we have a little advertisement that is advertising the very next thing we're going to open, which is the dramatic conclusion of the death of a president. Real quick, we will look at some of the advertisements from this one. You guys know I love to do that. So here we have the Ford dealer's 4th annual white sale. This is the Hot Ford Galaxy 500, it says. Beautiful. Very lovely. combat medics in a hospital in Vietnam. Interesting. Well, I'm not going to look anymore. I'm too much in the mode of the moment. Perhaps you are as well. It's really difficult to contemplate how that would have been to hear Bob Kennedy's voice and have it be so similar to the man in the coffin. For Jackie to be telling him about it and him just listening, of course, to his sister-in-law, to the first-hand account that he's getting of what happened, what she experienced. Well, now we have Look magazine, the dramatic conclusion. It says, William Manchester tells of hushed conversations at Bethesda, of plans for the funeral, of friction between LBJ and JFK partisans as power changed hands at the White House. We have one advertisement here that's 7-Up. It says, wet and wild, pull the cap, bite off a swallow of 7-Up, big, bright, bold, clear to the bottom, first against thirst. So that's that. All right. The jarring change in Washington. That's quite an image, isn't it? The jarring change in Washington. Jean Kennedy Smith had been looking out a window of the Tower Suite at Bethesda Naval Hospital on Friday, November 22nd, 1963. Just in case you don't know who she is, she's the sister, the youngest Kennedy sister, that's between Bobby Kennedy and Ted Kennedy. She was watching the darkness press hard against the cold panes when a muted voice said, "She's here." She turned, and Jacqueline Kennedy was standing in the center of the drawing room. There, in the words of Ben Bradley, the chief of Newsweek's Washington bureau and a Kennedy friend, was this totally doomed child with that god-awful skirt, not saying anything, looking burned alive. She went into Ben's arms with a moan, a half-sob. He transferred her to his wife, Tony. Tony held her and said, "Here's your mother." Jackie turned to Mrs. Auchincloss with a wan smile and kissed her. Her mother said, "Oh, Jackie, if this had to happen, thank God he wasn't maimed." The widow embraced Nancy Tuckerman, who had been appointed White House Social Secretary a few months before. "Poor Tucky," she said quietly. "You came all the way down from New York to take this job, and now it's all over. It's so sad. You will stay with me for a little while, won't you?" Behind her stood Robert Kennedy. To Bradley, he was, quote, "the strongest thing you have ever seen." He was subdued, holding Jackie together, keeping everyone's morale up when his own couldn't have been worse. Beckoning Jackie aside, Bob told her, "They think they've found the man who did it. He says he's a communist." She stared. Oh my God, she thought, but that's absurd. Later, she would think about hatred and the highly charged atmosphere of Dallas. At the moment, however, she just felt sickened. It was like existentialism, entirely purposeless. And she thought, it even robs his death of any meaning. She returned to her mother. He didn't even have the satisfaction of being killed for civil rights. It's had to be some silly little communist. Janet Auchincloss invited her daughter to stay with her in Georgetown. There was no response. Then Mrs. Auchincloss said casually, "You know that the children are at O Street." Puzzled, Mrs. Kennedy asked, "Why are they there?" "Why, because of your message from the plane." "I sent no message. They should be in their own beds." "Mommy, my God, those poor children, their lives shouldn't be disrupted now of all times. Tell Miss Shaw to bring them back and put them to bed." Mrs. Auchincloss called Maud Shaw, but the nurse already knew. The softest whisper traveled fast in that suite. Secret Service agent Clint Hill had overheard the exchange and phoned Agent Tom Wells from the nurse's desk outside. "Jackie, are you going to tell the children, or do you want me to, or do you want Miss Shaw?" Mrs. Auchincloss asked. Mrs. Kennedy asked for an opinion. "Well, John can wait," Mrs. Auchincloss said, "but Caroline should be told before she learns of it from her friends." "Oh, yes, Mommy. What will she think if she suddenly—" She thought a moment and then said something that her mother thought wise. I'd like to tell them, but ask Miss Shaw to use her discretion. Janet Auchincloss didn't quite do that. She used her own discretion. Phoning the nurse, she began, "How are the children doing?" "They were fine," Miss Shaw replied. "A trifle confused, perhaps, but at their age they were resilient. They had been fed and were drowsy." "Mrs. Kennedy wants you to tell Caroline." Miss Shaw said in a low, desperate voice, "Please, no. Let this cup pass from me." "You must. There's no one else." "I don't have the heart. I can't destroy her little happy day." "I know, but you have to. Please, please, can't someone else do it?" "No, Mrs. Kennedy is too upset." Jacqueline's mother was determined to remove one last, perhaps crushing burden from her daughter's shoulders today. There was no more to say. They hung up. At 8:30, Miss Shaw put John to bed. Now it was the girl's turn. Miss Shaw said slowly, "Your father has been shot. They took him to a hospital, but the doctors couldn't make him better." The little girl buried her face in the pillow, crying. Miss Shaw stood by the bed, her rough hands fighting one another until the child slept. Then she tucked her in, crossed to John's crib and tucked him in, and sat alone in her room between them. We read an article about this very moment from Maud Shaw. She wrote an article that I'll link it in the comments below. We read it together, and she talked about this moment, but I don't remember hearing that it was at the impetus of Jackie having asked. That really would be a difficult ask, wouldn't it? Well, I think we're going to leave it there. That's enough for one day. I feel so sober about all of this. What a heavy moment for Jackie and Bobby to have their moment. For LBJ to be arrogantly talking about how nobody paid attention to him, even if you don't think he had a hand in the assassination, which many people do. Some people think perhaps he knew in advance or had given some sort of request for it. There's a fingerprint that links his personal body man, who also had done some killing and assassinations, to the 6th floor. You can look at that in your own time. But regardless of whether or not you think he had any hand in it or had any knowledge of it, for him to be thinking about himself in such a moment is really quite stupid. And we all know that presidents are generally narcissistic people. I mean, you basically have to be to make it to that level of power. To think that you have the capacity to rule a nation requires a certain amount of big-headedness, let's say, or a willingness to entertain what most average people would not consider possible for themselves. So we already know it would be a narcissist in that position, but you would think after everything that happened that Johnson would be a little willing to sit back and let history play out before he expects anyone to turn to him with honor and credence and deference, right? And I do wonder what happened with that call that came in. Was that LBJ's men trying to get him into the White House sooner? What do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I always appreciate reading your thoughts. I hope you're enjoying this time, and I will see you in the comments and hopefully see you in the next video. Have a great day. Bye.